Dear students, today in personality theories, we're going to learn about the contribution of Skinner in understanding personality better. In this module, you shall be able to learn about the origin and basic ideas of Skinner's behaviorism, learn about the life incidents that helped in shaping Skinner's work and career, identify the key difference in Watsonian and Skinnerian behaviorism, and also evaluate major strengths and weaknesses of Skinner's behaviorism. Some of the branches of psychology strive to understand underlying cognitions, but behavioral psychology is not concerned with mentalistic causes of behavior and instead focuses on the behavior itself. Behavior analysis is rooted in the behaviorist tradition and utilizes learning principles to bring about behavior change. Let's start with the analysis of behavior. There are two major areas of behavior analysis, one experimental and the other applied. Experimental behavior analysis involves basic research designed to add to the body of knowledge about behavior. Applied behavior analysis, on the other hand, is focused on applying these behavioral principles to real-world situations. Behavior analysis has robust practical applications in mental health treatment and organizational psychology, particularly when focused on helping children with autism and adults learning new behavior or reduce problem behavior. Rather than focusing on internal states, ABA therapists focus on observable behaviors and utilize behavioral techniques to bring about behavioral change. Let's look at experimental analysis of behavior. Experimental analysis of behavior is part of scientific behavior analysis that aims at describing the functional relationship between classes of stimuli and responses, also demonstrating reliability and generality between them. It includes a general scientific approach which outlines various assumptions regarding how to study the behavior, the methods and procedures involved in studying the behavior, developing a systematic body of knowledge of behavior, along with understanding its practical implications for society and culture. To fulfill these objective, experimental analysts developed general laws of behavior after repeated testing and the substantiation through experimental procedure. Historically, in behavioral psychology, the origin of experimental analysis of behavior can be traced back to the experimental behavior analysis of Edward Lee Thorndike and Ivan Pavlov. However, the roots of experimental analysis of behavior can also be traced back to naturalism of Aristotle and other Greek philosophical traditions. Pavlov contributed to the experimental analysis of behavior through his work on classical conditioning, while Thorndike, through his experiments, developed many laws of behavior that work like guiding principles of later behaviorist theory. The main psychological process involved in experimental analysis of behavior is depicted in the figure, which will be in your e-text. Classical conditioning is a learning procedure in which a neutral stimulus acquires a capacity of eliciting the same response in the organism that can only be evoked by original stimulus. In Pavlovian terminology, original stimulus is known as unconditioned stimulus, while the original reflex response of organism is known as unconditioned response. Unconditioned response is a naturally occurring response at the presentation of unconditioned stimulus. For example, salivation occurs at the sight of tasty food. Through classical conditioning procedure, a neutral stimulus, which is called unconditional stimulus, can acquire the same capacity after repeated pairing with the unconditioned stimulus. Operants are those behavior that are voluntary. Operant conditioning is a learning procedure in which voluntary or natural responses can be learned through the effect of pleasant and unpleasant consequences of the response. Habituation is a kind of learning in which the organism stops to respond after repeated exposure to the stimulus. One of the possible reasons of habituation could be that the brain stops sending signals when repeatedly flooded with the same stimulus over a period of time. Habituation also relies on the principle of cognitive economy as it helps in filtering out large amount of unnecessary and similar information from the environment so that organism can focus more on the useful and important information. Whereas in contrast to habituation, sensitization is a non-associative form of learning in which the response improves after the repeated exposure of stimuli. When we talk about Skinner's contribution to the experimental analysis of behavior, it was mainly in the form of philosophical contribution and development of theoretical propositions that can act as a theory explaining the functional relationship between classes of stimuli and responses. It is also known as conceptual analysis of behavior. The principle of operant conditioning was one of the remarkable contributions by Skinner in the area of experimental analysis of behavior. As already told, the foundation of operant learning was already laid down by Thorndike. Skinner, however, developed this idea in a systematic manner to develop a full-fledged system of psychology. He developed the theory of operant conditioning through a series of papers and books that he published between 1930 till 1990s with the aim of developing a comprehensive system of behavior analysis. Before we move forward, let's have a look at the history of behavior analysis. First thing, behaviorism was largely established through the influential work of three theorists. First was Ivan Pavlov, second was John B. Watson, and third was B.F. Skinner. Pavlov also discovered the conditioning reflex during his studies with dogs, establishing classical conditioning as a learning method. However, it was Watson who extended Pavlov's theory to apply to human behavior, establishing behaviorism as a major school of thought. Skinner later introduced the concept of operant conditioning, in which reinforcement leads to a desired behavior. These concepts continue to play influential roles in behavior analysis, behavior modifications, and psychotherapy. Contemporary academia considers Skinner as a pioneer of modern behaviorism, along with John Watson and Ivan Pavlov. Let's have a look at what was Skinner's behaviorism all about. Skinner stood at the opposite position from humanistic psychology during his whole career and denied humans possessing freedom and dignity, as it is evidenced in his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Most of his theories were supposed to be based on self-observation, which caused him to become a supporter of behaviorism. Much of his self-observed theories stem from Thorndike's puzzle box, a direct antecedent to Skinner's box. He further expanded on Thorndike's earlier work by introducing the concept of reinforcement to Thorndike's law of effect. He was also an advocate of behavioral engineering, and he thought that people should be controlled through the systematic allocation of external rewards. Skinner believed that behaviors are casual factors that are influenced by consequences. If the consequences are bad, there was a high chance that the action would not be repeated. However, if the consequences were good, the actions that led to it would be reinforced. He called this principle of reinforcement. It is a central concept in behaviorism and was seen as a central mechanism in the shaping and control of behavior. He also invented operant conditioning chamber, also known as Skinner box. He innovated his own philosophy of science called radical behaviorism and founded his own school of experimental research psychology, the experimental analysis of behavior, coining the term operant conditioning. His analysis of human behavior culminated in his work Verbal Behavior, as well as his philosophical manifesto Walden II, both of which have been recently seen enormous increase in interest experimentally and in applied settings. Before we move on to what he proposed in his theories, early roots of Skinnerian behaviorism. Before we understand Skinnerian behaviorism, let's have a look at what behaviorism is all about. It is a system of psychology that admits only overt, observable and measurable behavior as its subject matter. The roots of Skinnerian behaviorism can be traced to the early part of the 20th century in the simmering discontent with the then two most dominant schools of psychology, that is structuralism and psychoanalysis, which believed that mental analysis through introspection, that is structuralism, or scrutiny of unconscious forces underlying in human personality are the core matter of psychological investigation. John B. Watson and Ivan Pavlov, through their independent researches, came to the conclusion that all psychological functions can be explained through nerve impulses, muscular movements, and glandular secretions. According to them, any instant of mentalizing can be ultimately be reduced in terms of simpler, objective, and measurable properties like nerve impulses, muscular movements, and glandular secretions, which can be diagnosed using experimental procedure. Watson, in his influential paper Psychology as a Behaviorist Views It, formally laid the foundation of a unitary and reductionist science of behaviorism, wherein he claimed having no distinction between a man and brute. His version of behaviorism denied the role of mental faculties in human growth or any aspect of it. In the words of Watson himself, he says, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select, be it doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar, man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocation, and race of his ancestors." Unquote. The brash and flamboyant personality Watson and his fresh ideas attracted many researchers, scientists, and philosophers who had a stake in inquiry of human structure, human nature, and many of them became later the chief proponent and carrier of Watsonian behaviorism. Watsonian behaviorism was represented by two sets of ideological commitments. First, those who believed that behavior is all that a researcher can and should study, for which a strict adherence to an objective methodology is required, which is called methodological behaviorism. Second, those who held a metaphysical position that there is no such entity like mind at all, which was called metaphysical behaviorism. The latter type of behaviorism was represented further by Skinner, who totally rejected any reference to mental events or consciousness and later founded his own school of radical behaviorism. Let's have a look at a brief biographical sketch of Skinner. He was born on March 20, 1904 in Pennsylvania, USA. His father was a lawyer and his mother a housewife who attended to him and his brother at home. His early life was affectionate and stable, and he developed a liking for learning and doing innovative tasks early in his life, like building toys, wagons, model airplanes, etc. He studied in the same school where his father studied and excelled in studies. He did his graduation in English from Hamilton College, and after a gap did post-graduation and doctorate in psychology from Harvard University. Although Skinner was a bright student, but like many creative and independent scholars, he was not very happy with his student life. He also harbored the literary interest and dreamed of becoming a writer in his early career days. According to a story shared by Schulz and Schulz, Skinner participated in a summer poetry writing workshop wherein his poetry received positive comments from famous poets like Robert Frost. However, Skinner could not do much progress as a writer in spite of investing around 2 years to it. After this, he tried to establish himself in the field of consulting psychiatry, but he failed there too. As this was not enough, he failed in his love life too. Around half a dozen women had rejected him. So, in a nutshell, this is what briefly is what Skinner's life all about. Now let's move on to Skinner's radical behaviorism. Radical behaviorism seeks to understand behavior as a function of environmental histories of reinforcing consequences. Such a functional analysis makes it capable for producing technologies of behavior. This applied behaviorism lies on the opposite side of the ideological spectrum as a field of cognitive science. Unlike less austere behaviorism, it does not accept private events such as thinking, perceptions, and unobservable emotions in a casual account of an organism's behavior. It is a philosophy of science developed by Skinner which offers an experimental analysis of human-animal behavior. Skinner called his kind of behaviorism radical because radical means root, and Skinner thought his behaviorism is a thoroughgoing and deep behaviorism. The major features of radical behaviorism, we'll look into it one by one. According to Leahy, the major contributions of Skinner can be summarized under 3 broad categories. First, the philosophy of radical behaviorism. Second, the selection of experimental analysis of behavior. And third, the interpretation of human behavior from the perspective of radical behaviorism, or experimental analysis of behavior. These are discussed in the following section. We'll look into it one by one. First is the philosophy of radical behaviorism. Skinner offered his philosophy of radical behaviorism in a research paper titled A Critique of Psychoanalytic Concepts and Theories, in which he criticized Freudian mentalistic apparatus, id, ego and superego, and attendant mental process that often used to explain human behavior. Skinner was so influenced by the radical empirism of Francis Bacon and descriptive positivism of the German physicist Ernst Mach. Based on such intellectual traditions, he developed the philosophy of radical behaviorism, which had the following features. First, truth is to be found in observation only, in the does and doesn't, rather than in the interpretation of our observations. Secondly, a reflex is not an entity inside an animal, but merely a convenient descriptive term for a regular correlation between stimulus and response. By this, it simply means that radical behaviorism rejects any hypothetical entity like mind or consciousness. Mind is not an entity in its own rights, it's just a descriptive term according to it. Thirdly, evolutionary influence from Darwin's theory. According to Darwin's theory, a species through evolution inherits only those traits that help in the adaptation and survival. Similarly, Skinner also believed that an organism produces a variety of behavior but learns to repeat or retain only those that lead to favorable consequences or reinforced. The reinforced behavior helps in adaptation and survival, and non-reinforced behavior gradually disappears from organism behavioral repertoire. Point number 4, which was non-realism. Skinner's radical behaviorism was a straightforward extension on non-realism into psychology. Organism perceives the physical world directly. An internal mental world is a hypothetical concept that does not exist. Fifth point which he raised was functionalism. An organism's behavior is a function of environment to which the organism responds. The next point, environmentalism. It is the environment which provides a stimuli that elicit behavior as well as alter the probability of behavior. Behavior is a locus of environmental stimuli. Next function that he spoke about or aspect that he mentioned was mutual influence. Radical behaviorism's adherence to environmentalism does not mean that organism just passively reacts to the environment. The relationship between organism and environment is interdependent, reciprocal, and has mutual influence. Eighth point that they mention is that all behavior is determined. Radical behaviorism denies the agency of free will or choice and is of the view that all behavior is determined. Science is not possible with entities that home free choice. And the last point that radical behaviorism proposed is inductive idiographic approach. Skinner used an inductive approach and made generalizations based on particular instances studied and observed over a long period of time. Now let's look at an experimental analysis of behavior. According to Skinner, the goal of psychology is to analyze behavior by locating the specific determinants of specific behavior and establishing the exact nature of relationship between the stimulus as well as the response. The best way to do is by experiment, because only in experiment all the factors affecting behavior can be systematically controlled. Skinner thus called his science the experimental analysis of behavior. In his book, The Behaviour of Organisms, Skinner distinguished two kinds of learned behavior. Respondent behavior, which is similar to reflex behavior of Pavlov. It loosely corresponds to involuntary behavior like salutary responses studied by Pavlov. Operant behavior is behavior that is reinforced and that an organism learns to repeat based on the contingencies of reinforcement. According to Skinner, experimental analysis of behavior consists of systematic description of contingencies of reinforcement as they occur in all forms of behavior. Now let's look at what has been the contribution of Skinner in the understanding of human behavior. Skinner, like Thorndike, was very interested in applying his theory of learning to the process of education. According to Hergen and Olson, the method of program learning, person-aligned system of instruction, and online learning are part of Skinnerian legacy for which the field of education will forever remain ever indebted to him. These techniques are based on Skinner's approach that learning proceeds most effectively when the information to be learned is presented in small steps and the learners are given immediate feedback about the progress, as we have done in our modules. Skinner's method allows learners to learn at their own pace. He believed that reinforcement of desired behavior is more fruitful than punishment for undesirable behavior. Let's look at what the contribution of Skinner has been in the area of education. He pioneered the science of behavioral analysis and positive reinforcement as an educational tool. For him, the foundation of behavioral analysis becomes the control of experimental variables. He explicitly or implicitly addressed all 7 dimensions of applied behavior analysis. These principles comprise the pure science of behavior analysis. That means the principles used to describe how the behavior is lawful, observable, and measurable and has an impact on the environment have been adapted into teaching methods on those principles. Skinner also influenced education as well as psychology in both his ideology and literature. In Skinner's view, education has 2 major purposes. First is to teach repertoires of both verbal and non-verbal behavior, and secondly, to encourage students to display an interest in instruction. He endeavored to bring students' behavior under the control of the environment by reinforcing it only when particular stimuli were present. Behavioral techniques are still widely used in psychotherapy, counseling, education, and even in parenting. Skinner also had a vision for creating a better society. He believed shaping behavior of people to create a better society. Skinner was a behavioral engineer who offered his own technology of behavior through which we can shape the behavior of people to the level of desirability. For Skinner, behavior can be shaped through a series of successive approximations by selectively reinforcing certain responses and not reinforcing others. Skinner in his two books, Volume 2 and Beyond Freedom and Dignity, are the examples of his commitment to create a better society based on the principles of learning. His idea of autonomous man has important implications for modern concept of self as incorporated in humanistic psychology. But like most of the theorists, he also has been criticized and they were mired in certain controversies because of his preposition. Skinner was a radicalist par excellence, and in many ways he stood above his competitors. He commands a large followership. Skinner's followers are called Skinnerian, and some of his followers worship him as a demigod. Often critics of Skinner are more critical and less correct. William O'Donoghue and Kylie E. Ferguson have put criticisms about Skinner in two categories. One they call invalid criticisms of Skinner, and the second they say is valid criticism of Skinner. These are briefly outlined in the text so that you could understand it better. We'll briefly look into them one by one. First, we'll have a look at what are the various invalid criticisms of Skinner. The first one being, the Skinnerian science of behavior does not deal with the consciousness, cognitive processes, feelings and states of mind. The second criticism which comes his way is, the Skinnerian science of behavior ignores endowments and maintains that all behavior is learned within lifetime. The third criticism is that the science of behavior ignores intention and purpose. The fourth one says that the Skinnerian science of behavior does not deal with the self or sense of self or personality. The fifth criticism cites experimental results of Skinner under carefully controlled environment cannot be replicated in daily life. The sixth one says that Skinner's analysis of culture is necessarily anti-democratic because the relationship between experimental subjects is manipulative. Seventh, Chomsky's criticism of Skinner's verbal behavior can be summarized under three heads. Verbal behavior is an untested hypothesis which has therefore no claim upon credibility. The second one he suggests is that Skinner's technical terms were a mere paraphrase for more traditional treatment of verbal behavior. And the third he suggests is that speech is a complex behavior whose understanding and explanation requires a complex, meditational, neurological, genetic theory. There are a few valid criticisms of Skinner also which we need to consider in our understanding of Skinner's behaviorism. The first one being, Skinner's behaviorism is a theoretical, mere description and is insufficient to guide research. The second one suggests that the Skinner's behaviorism does make difference between rats, cats, robots, puppets, machines or human beings. Thirdly, science of behavior as offered by Skinner cannot deal with creative behavior as seen in music, literature and science. Fourthly, Skinner's analysis of punishment is at best only partially true. The fifth criticism is Skinner's experimental analysis of behavior has limited relevance to a complex human behavior. The sixth one says that the science of behavior given by Skinner cannot adequately understand, predict or control the behavior of any species without knowledge of its instinctive patterns, evolutionary history and ecological niche. The two ex-associates of Skinner, Marion Blevin and Keller Brelin, published a book in 1961 titled The Misbehavior of Organisms, which seems a parody on the title of Skinner's first major work, The Behavior of Organism, published in 1938. Brelin and Brelin found an instinctual drift in the various animals trained by them like raccoons, reorder pigs, chickens, etc. However, Skinner considered that the experimental analysis of behavior based on the principles of operant conditioning expressed in quantitative terms would yield a comprehensive picture of the organism as a behaving system, and a theory is nowhere needed in this task. In one of his articles, A Case History of Scientific Method, he outlined the virtues of hit and miss process. According to Skinner, if a scientist finds that one line of research is working, he can shift to another in a trial and error fashion. Unless he finds something of value, this gives more autonomy and freedom compared to restricting oneself to a set of theoretical framework. According to Brennan, it is not right to say that Skinner's approach of learning was atheoretical. Brennan has cited 3 elements of scientific theory construction given by Marx in his book of Theories in Contemporary Psychology, which also distinguishes scientific theory from art subjects, which you will learn in your due module. According to Brennan, although Skinner's positivism did not admit any constructs, but some constructs consist of loose assumptions about the nature of environment control are implied. Again, given the acceptance of environmental determinacy, testable hypotheses are generated by the Skinnerian system as well. According to Leahy, when Skinner asked, "Are theories of learning necessary?" and answered no. He did not intend to eschew theorizing. What he rejected was theory that refers to the unobserved hypothetical entities. He considered them as fiction, be they ego, cognitive maps, or apperception. He accepted theory in which the machine sense as being summary of the ways in which observable variables correlate, but no more. So what we have learned in this module, we need to summarize so that you could understand and retain it better. So let's look at point one by one. The first thing that we've learned through this module is that behaviorism is a system of psychology that admits only overt, observable and measurable behavior as its subject matter. The second, there are 2 major offshoots of behaviorism. One is classical behaviorism led by John Watson, and second is neo-behaviorism led by B.F. Skinner. The science of behaviorism, formally founded by Watson in 1913 with his influential paper Psychology as a Behaviorist, views it. Radical behaviorism, on the other hand, is a philosophy of science developed by B.F. Skinner, which offers an experimental analysis of human-animal behavior. According to Lee, the major contributions of Skinner can be summarized under 3 broad categories: the philosophy of radical behaviorism, the selection of experimental analysis of behavior, and the third one is the interpretation of human behavior from the perspective of radical behaviorism and experimental analysis of behavior. Skinner also believed in Darwinian idea of evolution and survival. According to him, an organism produces a variety of behavior that learns to repeat or retain only those that lead to favorable consequences or reinforced. The reinforced behavior helps in adaptation, and survival of non-reinforced behavior gradually disappears from organisms' behavioral repertoire. Skinner believed in shaping of behavior to create a better society. He was a behavioral engineer who offered his own technology of behavior through which we can shape the behavior of people to the level of desirability.